Is Sylvain Vittecoq. I really hope I pronounced that correctly again. My rusty French, still good?
That's good enough.
Good enough, thank you. So Sylvain Vittecoq is the founder and CEO of FileChain, and today's gonna talk about, I guess, FileChain and in particular identities and legal pros on Ledger to unleash Web3 in the industry 4.0. Stage is yours.
Stage is mine, thank you so much. So I'm going to stay here so that you can actually see the screen. My name is Sylvain Vittecoq, and yeah, that's probably indeed the first slide. So my talk is about Ledger we built at FileChain. So that's exactly like Bitcoin was built or Ethereum was built. Well, FileChain is layer 1 for those who know what that is. So that's actually a complete ledger from scratch, 100% European made. If you wonder, so there is no fork of code from anyone else. So we wanted that ledger to actually be very applicable to Web3. And so just to actually remind everyone what is Web3. Web 1 is about reading content, right? Web 2 was about the ability to read and write and contribute. And Web 3 is about ownership. And so indeed with ownership, you can of course own points, coins, or NFTs. We have discussed that the entire day. But with Web3, you can also own real-world assets, right? Even confidential data, personal data, that is also part of Web3, not too much discussed because we focus so much on the coins and the money part, but this is all of that. And so basically just a few examples of what could actually be part of Web3. And so the tracking of shipping containers is part of that. And indeed, anything in Industry 4.0, where you would have devices doing something, for some services and some money, is also part of Web3. So let's go into and my talk is a bit controversial. So if you don't like something, well, don't throw the rotten tomatoes, because this is indeed, the why we built that one ledger. And indeed, one of the reasons is simply because we don't believe so much into smart contracts. One, because indeed the logic cannot really be kept to yourself. You will have to give your logic to other servers and other people for them to run your code. And so that's one thing we don't like, because you cannot have confidentiality. Two, it's actually expensive to find people who can write smart contract code. So that's just, in my opinion, a no-go for most of the companies who actually want to scale in that business. Three, there is actually no real guarantee that your smart contracts will do what they're supposed to be doing. And we hear in the news quite often that, well, there have been some hacking here and there. And so at the end of the day, in software, there is always this thing about capping your liabilities. If there is any bug, if there is anything wrong happening, you are supposed to know by contract how much you will have to pay the others. That's not really possible with smart contracts. So that's why at FileChain, we have designed our ledgers without smart contracts. All right, so what is it that we have used? Well, we have used scripts. The Bitcoin way, for those who know how Bitcoin works, well, Bitcoin is actually running a script when you actually push Bitcoin from one address to another. This cannot be hacked ever, and so that's why we believe, well, with NFTs and assets, it is actually probably a simpler, cheaper way to transfer assets by using scripts. That's exactly why we have designed our ledger this way. And finally, a script will be able to transfer some ownership, yes, but you still cannot transfer information. And therefore, we believe with Web3, there is a fundamental need to be able to transfer information, data. And that's exactly what we can also do in a ledger like the one we have decided to design. By having end-to-end privacy between parties, it means if I have a document, a doc file, a PDF, a JPEG, you can actually directly drag and drop that document from your desktop and send it to someone else over the ledger, and that someone else will now be able to decrypt and access that specific PDF you were discussing about, and you can sign that document. The point is, no one else in the middle on that ledger will be able to access the document. So this is what is called end-to-end privacy, and that's the kind of thing we can actually do on our ledgers. to actually provide means for data on the ledger, right? And so, well, there is a lot more to go here, but basically you can even have ERP systems, basically companies working with each other, not just humans, which is what we usually talk about with public ledgers, but you can also end up with companies, and basically databases from companies, right? Systems from within each company transacting on a ledger with others, because you can now share data, but with confidentiality, but still on the ledger, so that it cannot be changed and it's recorded forever, right? And so the next thing is, well, but what about public ledgers? And well, again, at FileChain, we don't believe public ledgers are indeed going to cover all use cases, and instead we are more into what could be called, ecosystem-based ledgers. Simply because if you have gas fees to pay, right, to remunerate those running your smart contracts, well then you don't really know next month, next quarter, how much money you will have to spend to run your smart contracts. So from a company standpoint, business plan standpoint, well, that's actually a bit tough to plan ahead of time how much you will need to run your infrastructure. So we don't believe this is going to be useful to go mainstream. And something else which is extremely important, and you can feel this with any kind of NFT marketplace which was discussed before, every single Web3 application will have its own kind of evolution. One will evolve very quickly, they will have new needs, and so on, and we believe ledgers which are a bit more fine-tuned for each application will have a much greater way to adapt to the exact needs of that application, right? And so, if I click on the right button, the last two slides I have about those ledgers is indeed one which is extremely important, that's about identity on ledgers. It's usually not really talked about too much, and say Bitcoin, to just take that ledger you may know, well, the only thing you have to go by to identify someone is a string of numbers, which is going to be the recipient, where to send your Bitcoins to. That's not much, right? If I want to send or receive Bitcoins to one of you, I probably want to know your name, I want to know who you are, and so on. And so there is a lot more to do on a ledger than to just go for, some kind of a string of numbers. So that's why we have designed that ledger to also be able to do proper identity management. For those who know or who are into DeFi or banks, there is a know your customer, KYC, or some money laundering checks you can perform. That is all of that which can be done on a ledger we have built, because we know that will be required for Web3 to be adopted large scale. And finally, for any kind of companies starting a business on Web3, you will have to work with other companies, and so you will have to sign contracts. And today, most of you are probably part of a company. You may have to sign agreements, legal agreements, with others. Well, today what you do is you print on a piece of paper and you actually put those papers in the safe in the bank. Well, that's very old-fashioned, or you use DocuSign, right? But basically, you can now, with a ledger like ours, directly put all of that documentation and streamline those processes directly on the ledger. So we also believe that is required for Web3. That's what you need. Otherwise, well, you cannot go for the onboarding of all of your partners. And because I mentioned about privacy, even competitors should be able to work on the same ledger, right? That's, in my opinion, fundamental to end up with proper marketplaces and competition and whatnot. So this is a marketplace about anything, indeed NFTs, but this could just be about, well, how to produce screens we have in that room. And I am producing some of those screens, and someone else, a competitor of mine, is producing some screens as well. Well, then when we are selling to that facility here in Berlin, we may want to not share our pricing with the buyer. And so that's exactly the kind of thing we can be doing on a ledger like ours at FileChain, to make sure we can work from the same infrastructure, but we don't share pricing, we don't share what we don't want to share with others. And so that is indeed my last slide where we try to describe, our ledgers, FileChain as a bit of Bitcoin for the scripting piece, the Ethereum for the ability to take care of any kind of Web3 application, Hyperledger, for those who knows, from IBM, which is a bit more into the private or the enterprise space. That's exactly what we want to do. And we are also a decentralized DocuSign. So I'm sure many of you know about DocuSign. And again, at DocuSign, when you sign a document with someone else, that someone else is seeing that document, very good. But there are also a bunch of engineers at DocuSign who they may not want, and they may not see that document, but they could see that document the two of you are looking at and signing. That is exactly what would not be possible with FileChain, where it is only the parties who are supposed to see something who will actually be able to see it. And so that's basically the kind of ledger we have built, which we believe can be used for any kind of application in Web3. With that, I'm going to stop and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sylvain. If I may, then I would have also a question for you.
Sure.
So you mentioned that in FileChain you store data on-chain.
Mm-hmm.
So am I correct in understanding that there is no off-chain, let's say, service, and you just store a reference to it on-chain? You really store everything on-chain. If that's the case, wouldn't the size of the ledger hit you eventually?
So we support on-chain so that indeed the real documents, the real payloads can directly be on the ledger. But because those are not public ledgers, the ones using the ledger will be the one running the ledgers. So I'm going to let that one sink in a bit. It means this is not a public ledger where you have to pay miners to deal with all of the data you would put directly on the ledger, but instead here, those using the ledger will be the one running it, and therefore the cost to run that ledger and all of that data within the transactions will just be borne by those using that ledger, and if this is their business, sure, it will be okay for them to pay that price, but the data can directly be in transactions. And of course, for something like GDPR, if you really want the data to get out of your ledger, sure, you can do it, but we can also put anything we want directly on the ledger.
Okay. Thanks again. Another applause. Thank you, Sylvain. So our last speaker before the panel is Augusto Elesbao. Augusto is the lead developer for experience and tooling at Philips.